All right, so this is the latest episode of Out of Left Field. We decided to tackle the rather serious issue of immigration, refugees to this country.
Well, it's in the news everywhere, and it's kind of hard not to say anything about it. So it's a crisis that has been brewing for years. I don't think this is you could even say the crescendo of it. I think this is going to continue to be a big issue going forward. So, of course, the new Liberal government in Canada has decided to take 25,000 refugees.
Well, they had decided. That was the election promise, was 25,000 refugees before the end of this year. Now it's December now, and
they did realize that was a little bit too ambitious, and so I think they've delayed it a few months, but nevertheless, 25,000 within the short-term future is the target, and I'm quite happy to see that we're doing more to support the people that are in need there. 25,000 does seem like a little bit of an arbitrary number.
I think it's absolutely arbitrary.
How so?
Just well, I think that it's one of those numbers that the Liberals could have said 50,000. They could have said 100,000. They could have said 10,000. I think that this was a number they arrived at for purely campaign purposes.
Well, the fact that he made it was a campaign issue, and and it was part of the whole debate, and all the political parties had to come to some sort of position on what to do with the refugee crisis, so they kind of had to pick some number. And I don't know, as they're not at the time they weren't in power, so they didn't have access to, maybe the same statistics and data that the Conservatives did, so maybe they did have to just kind of spitball it.
I guess, but I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that it seems arbitrary with people's lives to actually pick numbers like that. I mean, if we're looking at the Conservatives of the past 10 years, the Liberals and the NDP both said, and I think honestly and truthfully said, that the Conservatives were purposely underfunding immigration, purposely underfunding the departments to deal with refugee issues, all that sort of stuff, in order to kind of shore up what is, as far as I'm concerned, their much more racist voting base. And their disinterest in funding government ministries properly anyway. All of that taken together means that to address that deficiency, to address that problem, required something a lot more than just a ballpark figure.
In their defense, they did say that 25,000 was sort of the starting mark, and if everything goes according to plan and everything's kosher, then they'll continue to take more as going forward. So, I don't know, whether or not 25,000 was arbitrary or not, I'm willing personally just to give them that. I'm just happy to see us giving more support, and instead of just pretending like the problem is like we're not in any position to do anything about it, or that it doesn't matter, like the Conservatives did. So I'm happy. I think we should welcome them with open arms, and I think we should take a hell of a lot more than 25,000. I think we should just do as much as we can to help.
Well, I agree with almost all of that. I guess it's more of just a matter of at a certain point, I'm happy to live in a country where an appeal of 25,000 refugees was actually political pandering. Where that was actually something the Liberals were saying and going, this is a good thing we're going to do, and you should vote for us, and maybe they didn't really have any real plan to do it.
Instead of Eastern European countries where they
we'll kick out 25,000 refugees before the end of the year.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
we'll build a wall. We'll
or
keep
whatever.
Votes.
Yeah, but I do think that the attitude within the Liberal Party of trying to prime the population with these kinds of numbers and with these rather simple arguments, instead of building institutions capable of addressing the core issues, really, it will hurt them in the long run, I think.
Well, okay, firstly, they will probably, I would assume, give back the funding to the federal agencies for immigration and the refugee programs that have been systematically underfunded for the last 10 years. So that would be a good start. But also, I think that this is such a unique crisis in the modern era that we haven't seen so many refugees for quite a long time. Like, this is like basically half the entire population of Syria that have migrated out of their borders in the last 3 or 4 years. And so I think that my point is that not any country is equipped to deal with this in such a short period of time.
That's fine.
And these institutions that can handle this, that we should build, will come out of the lessons and the struggles and the practice that we have taking in these 25,000 families. And then we kind of can work from there. Networks are built, communities are built, there are new people coming to new places, and they will build the foundations for the next wave of refugee families and people that come after them. So I think it's kind of a more touch and go than building the institutions right from the get-go.
Well, maybe, but obviously those communities won't be having too many single men in them.
That is a notable thing that the Trudeau government said that they would not do.
But this is what I mean, is that, they've said they're not, that of the refugees, the 25,000, they're not going to be allowing single men in. So, men with families, younger, I guess, I don't know where the cutoff is, but presumably not the age of majority if you're a young boy, whatever. But that adult single men with no attached family cannot be a part of that 25,000 figure. On the presumption, I assume, and it was, I don't know, it was kind of left a little just sort of hanging there, but I think the implication is that that those people may be terrorists.
That they're statistically more likely to be, or...
But that flies in the face of the notion that the government is actually doing background checks at all.
Well, I don't think so. I think that it was a way to placate the racists in Canada, and the people that are just generally xenophobic and scared of other cultures.
Sure, but I mean, and that's true. And look, don't get me wrong. I said in a past episode that I didn't really think Canada had a racism problem or something along those lines. But whatever it was, I've kind of, in hindsight, I was wrong, all right, completely wrong. But that problem of racism is that when I was talking about sort of the broader job of the government in dealing with this crisis, I wasn't just meaning properly funding institutions, but also kind of philosophy or an understanding of the situation that allows for convincing people to change their minds. Because to treat this as just, because it usually is treated this way, that, well, it's a racist generation and we just have to wait till they die. Well, that doesn't always happen. And it's, I think, a little bit of a dodge to sort of say, well, there's just 30% of the population who are just unrecoverable racists, and we just need to kind of squirrel away the rest of the country and wait for those people to just go away. Yeah.
Well, as it turns out, racist people often pass on their racist beliefs to their racist children.
And I think that the pandering to them through not allowing single men in, this kind of somewhat odd policy on its own, does nothing to address that deeper issue.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they go through extremely extensive background checks and screening before they come in here anyway, so I think it's kind of moot anyway.
Well, it's not moot. Apparently, the Liberal government itself doesn't think it's moot because they don't want them coming in. I mean, ignoring the issue of actual racists in this country, from a policy standpoint, what is the reason for it?
I think it has everything to do with the Paris attacks. There is such a high level of paranoia after that, and people, just because of the fact of immigration and Islam and migrants and terrorism, and it's all sort of getting all into one big nebulous sort of issue, even whether or not it's related at all. So I think that people are scared, and the government... Basically, we have 4 million refugees to choose from. They probably just said...
for Christ's sakes.
No, 4 million.
I know.
When you say that, 25,000 is not even a drop in the bucket. It's less than 1% of the total amount of refugees, and which I think we should take way more than that.
I do too, but when we start playing the numbers game on this, why don't we just be complete assholes and say, we'll take 25,000 university-educated, well-off people, because we have the opportunity to make those kinds of bullshit We're not fucking buying them. We shouldn't be treating them like this is some kind of stock we're choosing from.
Okay.
These are human beings, and we should be bringing them in as families, as individuals, but as fucking people.
Yes, I fully agree with you. I just think that the backlash of the Paris attacks and the paranoia that ensued after that made them just err on the side of complete paranoia caution and say, okay, no single men, no people that are statistically more likely to be terrorists, and
So no one from Syria would be the simplest answer to that.
Okay, sure, but well, no, actually, most of the assailants in the Paris attacks were from Belgium, by the way. So,
no Belgians then. I mean, if we're going to play this stupid game, it just cause all kinds of problems.
Yeah, okay, sure, but I think that if we can take 25,000, and I'm not defending the Liberal government's policy on not allowing single men here, but if we can take 25,000 families in from the get-go and that works and that's fine, and Buddy's like, hey, I've got a brother in Syria, I've known him my whole life, and he can vouch for him, and then maybe they can start taking in single men that have connections, and maybe it can be kind of a, we can progress into it, and as time goes on, people's paranoia will subside, and we'll get used to the fact that Syrian refugees are fine, and they're helping our communities, and they're doing good, and they fit right in, and everything's kosher. So,
but no, because if there is a terrorist attack in this country, without having gone to the trouble of convincing people, of having a robust policy that says that this isn't an issue for us, that we don't actually consider one particular group in these refugees to be worse off than the other, that by going through that trouble, then if and when those attacks happen, it won't completely scuttle the whole program, which is probably what'll happen, considering the Liberals are willing to just change the policy on a whim based on attacks in another country. If it happens here, they might just say, well, screw it, we're going to stop it altogether, and then maybe in a couple of years we'll see what we can do.
It's worth mentioning that we've already decided to take 2.5 times more refugees than America has. I think it's pretty shameful that America has arguably caused this refugee crisis and doesn't want to do its fair share of cleanup job. Tony Blair and the former leader of the American Special Forces both said that if America hadn't invaded Iraq in 2003, then ISIS wouldn't exist.
Oh, Tony Blair said. Okay, I don't care what Tony Blair has to say. If that man said the sky was blue, I'd have to look outdoors. The guy... look, yes, it's a complicated issue. I think the United States had a lot to do with that. But there's this weird attitude of saying, like, what countries... the fair share of a country isn't the issue here. It's not like we should be looking at this 4 million people and then just dividing it up amongst the countries that
are responsible
for the mess, because that would end up with like what?
That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying they should take a couple more than 10,000.
10,000 is an absurdly low number.
They could just build a town in the middle of nowhere and just put them all there. And
they did that. Yeah, well, they've done that a few times before with different cultural groups, and it's generally not worked out very well.
No, I wasn't implying that it would. I'm just saying that that's the size of a very small town in America, and they could just build one, and there you go.
Yeah, well, small town America, I hate to tell you this, is
not what it's cracked up to be.
Not what it's cracked up to be, no. It's not exactly the idyllic fantasy world.
And to be fair, Norway was considering putting their migrants in Svalbard, which, for those of you who don't know where Svalbard is, it is very close to the North Pole.
It sounds cold. The name alone sounds cold.
It is. There are more polar bears than people on Svalbard. But the reason they didn't do it is because it's a territory of Norway and they don't have proper jurisdiction, and so there was too much paperwork.
Dump people there. Yeah, all right, yeah, sure. There are plenty of absurd examples of governments that are trying to quote do the right thing, making incredibly short-sighted decisions, and the United States is definitely one of them. I think that probably the reason in their case, though, as opposed to trying to balance out a relatively good idea with a bunch of bad stuff and hoping no one will complain too much, as in our case, I think that Obama's position on 10,000 is probably just has to do with the election. That he wants to give whoever is running, Hillary Clinton probably, it wants to give them not a lot of political baggage. He wants to pick a number that's not an insult, like literally like maybe a couple hundred people, you know,
Right.
a number that you say that's a decent size of people. That's more people than I'll ever meet, right? But not so much that it ever becomes much of an issue.
Yeah, that's probably fair. It's funny you say during an election. It's like a year away, for Christ's sake.
They're always in an election. I guess that's a bit of an unfair thing to say. Then.
Yeah, they are always.
Well, it's election season because it's not the day of the election.
But I mean, my God, the way that a lot of governors in the United States have said that no, we're not going to take any refugees because we're in the South and conservative and we don't like refugees. And then, of course, the federal government had to remind them that they don't actually have that jurisdiction to decide whether or not refugees come in, and it's tough luck. Now, I do think it's nice that in Canada, with some notable exceptions, we are a little bit more welcoming, and we've actually had rallies in support of taking more refugees, like here in Victoria and other places. The Premier of Saskatchewan did not have exactly the same feelings about that. I think he said that if even one bad apple gets in through the rest, then we should call the whole system into question, and that we should be careful and paranoid about letting refugees in. That is really exactly the kind of attitude that breeds xenophobia and tensions between the different camps, and I think that's really the whole problem to begin with.
That's what I'm saying, is that this is about a deeper issue. This is about the issue of systemic racism in this country or any other, but that, you know, if the government were serious about that, it wouldn't be simply declaring figures. It wouldn't be just creating, you know, ham-handed policies and then sort of jury-rigging a semi-racist solution that is good enough for everyone. I mean, it's tough to appeal to sort of a principle in a situation like this, in a crisis. It's difficult to say, you know, we need to have ideas that can help us when this happens again. But we do need those ideas, and it will happen again.
What ideas do you mean?
I mean, ideas that don't just revolve around like the refugee crisis as a political football, that don't treat it as some kind of thing we need to solve here in Canada on an electoral level. That this is, you know, we're all people, we're all on the same planet. We do have fundamental things that disagree us, and are, you know, and when it comes to economics and stuff like that, we do have sincere and real issues that need to be addressed. But when we're talking about refugees, when we're talking about people, 4 million people that need help, that's all that should be, you know, mattering to us, and it's not. And the reason is because that principle is not being presented in that way. It's not really relevant to our political system, to our whole fucking economy. We don't have a political or economic system that allows us to be able to do that, to be able to be decent to each other on that kind of scale. We have to settle for 25,000.
And any more than that becomes a controversy or something to worry about.
Yeah, maybe we'll get 50,000, and that's pretty good, right? That's not nothing.
Well, you know, I think that the vast majority of Canadians are probably in support of it. I think that the issue is probably with the same 30% of people that voted for Stephen Harper in the last election, the very loud, vocal, obnoxious, xenophobic minority who live probably in Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Manitoba. I feel kind of... Hey, they actually voted NDP in the last election.
Well, sure. All right.
But
the interior.
Yes. I feel quite happy for any refugees that end up in Canada, and a solemn sort of pity for those who end up actually in a place that's totally racist, like Manitoba. Still probably better than a refugee camp in Lebanon.
Winnipeg. Winnipeg. I love that. Winnipeg is... They should have that on the fucking billboards going into town. Winnipeg, probably better than a refugee camp in Syria. We, you know... Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. It's a decent place to live, but well, for one thing, it's fucking cold a lot of the time. So God only knows what that does. But not much for the Ministry of Tourism. I'll just say that. But this isn't so much about that. This is from a local standpoint. Certainly, we can make fun of Winnipeg or whatever, but the fact of the matter is that these are cities that can take in more than 25,000 people.
Well, yeah, I mean, the local governments have given, across the country, given pledges to the federal government and done assessments and shown studies of how many refugees that they can take. And
this is an emergency situation.
Yeah, and I think the number was actually more than 25,000, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it was. I don't know exactly the exact number because this is coming from like thousands of towns and such across the country, but the basic point is that the government's figure, estimate though it might be, is still below what the country, generally speaking, can just take in right now, like today. The city of Victoria can take in many more people than our current refugee program would actually be providing. As an emergency, right? Like, this is the important thing to keep in mind, that when these municipalities are presenting these estimates, they're not talking about, like, going forward a few years from now, they'll have a nice house and a home and all that kind of crap, but just, we have beds, we have warm places to live, we have the stuff to take in refugees and hopefully, integrate them into the local community if they want to live there.
Yeah, I think a lot of refugees are going to be housed in military barracks and facilities and churches and places of worship, that sort of thing. Basically, anywhere there's places to sleep.
any large space that isn't being really used for anything.
That has a bathroom and, a sink and a kitchen.
And that's
it.
I mean, those are emergency things. So this is as refugees. Then as they go through the whole citizenship process and all that kind of crap, they can eventually, once they become citizens, they can go to whatever province they actually want to live in, as opposed to Saskatchewan. And through that, they get the great privilege that every Canadian has of not having to live in Saskatchewan.
Let's keep making fun of the interior for being the only provinces to vote Conservative in the last election.
Well,
I think it'll be really interesting to see. BC, here, we're getting about 3,000 refugees.
Yeah.
And I assume that most of them are probably going to be coming to Vancouver and Victoria.
Sure.
And
not so much Victoria. I mean, we're still, not to put my hometown down, but we're not exactly on, like, international... We're not an international level city, let's say.
No, that's true. But I hunch we'll probably be getting a couple of those 3,000. But Vancouver will be getting a lot of them. And I think what unites Victoria and Vancouver is that we have very low vacancy rates. We have two of the three highest vacancy rates in the entire country. So it can be very difficult to find apartments, housing, places to rent.
Well, it's not just the vacancy rates itself. It's we're also talking about some of the highest cost parts of the country as well.
Yeah, exactly. We have Vancouver and Victoria are some of the hottest real estate markets, along with Toronto. And it's very expensive to live here. Rents are really high, and it's really hard to find a decent place to live. And when you do, it's way more expensive than you would have thought. So both of our cities suffer from a chronic shortage of public housing. This has been going on for years. This is a systemic issue. Most of the property, of course, is owned in private hands and is developed, guess what, for condos on a for-profit basis, and they're always overpriced and usually sold to foreign buyers, whether that's from Alberta or China or Ontario.
You know what? I agree. Albertans are foreign buyers.
Yeah.
Fuck them. Go back to your fucking province. If there's anything that this country has proven, for all the racist attitudes we do hold deep inside and amongst certain members of the population, I do think it is true that we are so much more bigoted towards all the other provinces than anything else. And if there's one first step to any refugee coming to this country, it's to learn which provinces to hate.
And that's totally relative based on which province you land in. My point is that if we have an influx of refugees in Vancouver and maybe Victoria, it's going to put more pressure on the systemic lack of public housing that we have in both cities. Because there's not a lot of affordable places to live. And I think that my hope, in a best case scenario, this is going to force the municipalities to seriously address this issue. However...
Oh, come on.
No, I'm just saying best case scenario. I'm not saying most likely scenario.
How many situations have been a quote, red light, homelessness is going to... When it gets this bad, we'll have to do something about it. And then it ends up, not quite. We can always legislate some bullshit away.
My point is that it's going to make this issue worse. And I think that...
Oh, true enough.
Now, the best case scenario is that we'd address the issue properly and responsibly. And the worst case scenario is that it will probably cause a sort of xenophobic backlash in our communities against the refugees, saying things like, I can't find a decent apartment to live in thanks to those damn refugees who've taken up all the places to live kind of nonsense, right? Like, you took our jobs kind of shit. And so I don't want to see that happen, but I think that unless the issue of public housing is seriously addressed by the municipalities, then I think that it's probably going to have some negative backlash because of it.
It really does get into the whole economic foundations for racism, right? I mean, if we had jobs for everyone, if we had full employment, and that was a reality, and full housing, and simple things like that, then this wouldn't really be even the beginning of an issue. But the fact that we have unemployment, the fact that we don't have housing available in really any quantity on a cheap level, particularly in Victoria, means that these simple issues, I don't want to say that the Syrian crisis is a simple issue, but when you're talking about, say, 1,000 people coming to Victoria, that's fairly straightforward. You just need to have somewhere for them to live for a while. But without sort of a robust economic system capable of sustaining that kind of growth, then what we're looking at is a crisis, and ultimately, without sort of a political answer to that crisis, racism and xenophobia take hold in people's minds. Take hold in people's minds, mind you, that might not have even been racist before.
Yeah, and I think what we're talking about happening in Victoria, maybe with the prospect of perhaps 1,000 people coming in, is exactly what's happening in Europe on a way, way, way bigger scale, where you have a massive backlash against refugees in some countries where they're just completely overwhelmed.
And where is the backlash least? Where the economy is doing best.
Germany.
Yeah, exactly. And yet, much of the economic growth in Germany is due to the fact that they're able to run the EU pretty much as they want. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be doing well, but more just that the way our broader international economy works, the way capitalism works, it does create these inequalities and these problems that foster racism and xenophobia and bigotry. And, not to be sort of going to the end of the line here, but, that's the issue, ultimately, as far as I'm concerned, as a socialist, right? That this is the problem, and, whatever the liberals might be trying to do with 25,000 people, so long as they don't address this, so long as there isn't a government in Canada that is addressing the problems created by capitalism, they will find themselves making stupid decisions and mistakes, and then suddenly the Conservatives will be back in power, and the country will be just as racist as ever. That can happen. I mean, every liberal government and every conservative government acts like it's the end of the previous era and, a bright new future and all that kind of crap. And it just so happens that they do dumb things, or they become full of themselves, and it results in these kind of problems without understanding how these issues arise. You don't have to know how the Syrian civil war and the ISIS and all that crap is going on, but just without being able to understand how and why there aren't enough jobs for people is it engenders this kind of bigotry. It engenders the kind of short-sightedness that, well, Canada was better before these people came here, or whatever.
To be fair, though, I agree with all of that, but I think it is worth noting that there's still different approaches that different countries can take at welcoming or not welcoming refugee or foreign populations. And I think that the Canadian stance of multiculturalism is a far better reaction than what the Europeans are doing. In Canada, you see in France where they have this sort of xenophobic reaction where they want to ban parts of Islam, and Islam is they're shutting down mosques, and they are all across Europe. You have minority communities that are living in these sort of ghettos that are sort of ostracized.
Well, they're literal ghettos. I mean,
they're ostracized from the broader culture, and they're they're not French, they're not German, and so they sort of react to that, right? In Canada, we allow people to have their culture, keep their culture, whatever. That's fine. You can do that. It's okay. And
unless you're in Quebec,
I was just going to say, with the notable exception of Quebec,
at times they vacillate. To be fair, right? I mean,
yeah, but I mean here, you can just have your culture and that's okay. And then by the second or third generation, they've basically integrated into Canadian culture. We're not saying anything they're doing is wrong, or like whatever. You can just enjoy Canadian life, and eventually it wins. And you can sort of discard the antiquated conservative elements of a culture and keep the good ones. It enriches Canadian life, and it makes our culture more diverse and strong and interesting. And it's better that way, and we don't have to hate anybody. We don't have to be afraid of anybody.
That's beautiful. There is a segment of the population that hasn't been integrated, hasn't been able to take part in this grand experiment that we call Canada.
Alberta?
No, Ben. No, a much more significant portion of the population. You might say even the original Canadians, in fact.
Oh, I see.
Yes. What about Aboriginals? How does this fit into our better way of doing things?
Yes. That is the notable exception to the blatant idealism that I was saying.
Yeah, before. Notable exception. I consider it fucking indicative, if anything. Our treatment of Aboriginals has historically been abysmal, to be fair, murderous in some cases, at the very least, poor. Right, nothing.
You mean at the very best poor?
Well, least is in least of our interest, but yes, at the best poor. We're generally dismissive of it, I guess would be the phrase. I mean, it seems like in many cases in Canadian culture we treat the Aboriginal peoples pretty much the same way we treat the monarchy. Something that's there. Something that we have to defer to at certain specific times, but it's really not relevant in our daily lives. It's ceremonial at best, and then we can ignore it the other, 364 days of the year.
Yeah, I think the Aboriginals would be a lot better off if Canada treated them with the same open arms and respect as the refugees from Syria.
But is it open arms? Because this is getting into the issue of the value of culture, the value of an independent culture, the relevance of that, particularly for people who have been treated so poorly for so long. The fact that they have this culture that's theirs and that they want to hold on to in order to maintain their own identity as an independent people.
Okay, but this is exactly what I was saying before. The way that Canada treats Aboriginal populations is a lot like the way France treats the Arab population there, that they're kind of second-class citizens, they're not respected, they're not treated as equals, they live in ghettos, and so they end up reacting to that and being fearful of mainstream culture and protecting their cultural identity and passing, and guarding it.
But is that protection a bad thing? I mean, I when I see someone wearing a niqab or whatever, I mean, I understand that there are religious obligations behind that in many cases, but there are also cultural traditions behind that as well, and so there's some degree of nuance there, and you can say we should just do nothing when it comes to that sort of thing, and in that case, I do agree that there's really not much to be said about it, but that when we're talking about a people, an independent cultural group, an independent nationality coming to this country, either as refugees or as immigrants or as the original inhabitants, to suggest that the best way to erase their cultural independence is by treating them like ourselves seems to have a real sinister undertone to it.
I don't think there's any sinister undertone. I think the goal of multiculturalism is so that we can all coexist and we can share the best aspects of our culture, and we can both integrate and we can be separate. We can keep the best aspects of our culture that we want. We can live the way that we want, and we can respect others for being different. I wish that we provided that same logic towards how we treated Aboriginals, and we really don't. But I think that that's kind of what multiculturalism is all about: retaining your own culture and respecting others at the same time. And you can still kind of share things here and there, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, but you're suggesting this for Syrian immigrants, at least, on the basis that the more confusing and disturbing aspects of their culture will just be divested over time. So don't worry, the things that Canadians find unappealing or confusing will be abandoned in the future.
You mean the niqab?
Yeah, niqab or whatever. I mean, it doesn't have to be Syrians. It doesn't have to be this or that issue. But the idea is that there is some kind of baseline Canadianism that anyone who comes into this country, if we treat them through the lens of multiculturalism, they will eventually just adopt.
No, all I'm saying is that the multiculturalism approach is better than the way that the Europeans, or in fact the Americans, handle it, where you have your one mainstream culture, which this is French culture and this is not French culture, this is American, this is not American. And it creates this alienation and the separation between immigrant communities and the people that already live there, where they're treated like second class, their culture isn't respected enough, it's not treated as an equal. Whereas in Canada, you can have your culture and that's fine, and nobody except for people in the interior are going to criticize you or be racist towards you for it. And eventually, because we accept them, we are better at integrating immigrants into our culture. That doesn't mean like, there's some sinister goal in mind or whatever. It just means that we're better at getting along with people, and we don't have third generation Canadians speaking English with a Turkish accent like you have third generation Germans speaking German with a Turkish accent, because they have created these cultural ghettos and these disrespected second-class communities, and that's just not a good way to work about these things in the long term. Multiculturalism is better.
Firstly, I do think it is better. It's just that there's this implication that someone who speaks with a Canadian accent is better than someone who speaks with a Turkish accent.
No, I just think that it's a sign of better integration, more fluidity, and more cooperation between cultures.
But why is integration a goal in this case? I mean, I understand integration in the sense of understanding how Canada works or how a particular government works, so you can take part in it, you can be involved in the rest of the country, you can be doing things. But from a cultural standpoint, I don't see the relevance of it.
The relevance of it how?
The relevance of actually changing in any way. Like if you're saying, well, if we treat them this way, their culture won't integrate, and that's a problem. Well, I agree there are unfortunate and serious implications to certain aspects of certain cultures, and I'm not a cultural relativist. I do think there are things that are wrong in the world, and I do think that people promote certain ideas that are wrong, but that if we're looking at this from the cultural standpoint, if we're looking at it from the kind of accents they have, the kind of languages they speak, the sort of foods they eat, none of that really concerns me. And it seems like that's exactly the sort of thing that will be divested in this kind of end goal of multiculturalism.
No. You're thinking of this in like multiculturalism has the end goal of a singularity of culture where we all integrate into one. But that is not it. That is the American way, the boiling pot of cultures where you all mix and you're all Americans and whatever. But with Canada, with multiculturalism, you can keep your culture. You can still have your cultural festivals. The federal government will give you money and sponsor you to have your cultural festivals. You can still speak your language. You can still do all that, dress the way you want, eat the foods you want, all that. That's fine. But the fact that there is an openness and there is a respect and there is a tolerance and a cooperation between different cultures is better for integrating everybody together so that we all get along and still maintain our culture. What I'm addressing really is the fact that Canadians are afraid that immigrants will be extremists and do terrorism and do all sorts of crazy shit. But the fact of the matter is that very fear of immigrants is what causes that backlash. The fact that in France, where you had people from Belgium commit these terrorist acts, where these were kids from communities that were alienated, that were spat upon by the mainstream culture, that didn't respect their minority community status, that they thought of them as second-class citizens. And if Canadians want to lower the chances of having some sort of incident happen here, the best thing that we can do is to welcome refugees with open arms, to take as many as we possibly can, to give them everything that we can, and do our best to help them. Because what ISIS wants is for Westerners to hate Muslims. That plays right into their narrative. Their narrative is that Westerners are bad, Christians are bad, they hate us, they want to destroy us, they want to bomb us with drones, they want to kill your family. And that's exactly what Western countries are doing and playing right into their hands. The response of more bombings, more airstrikes, more this, more that, that is exactly what got us into this fucking problem in the first place. That is why ISIS exists, is because we have been, not we Canada, but we Western countries, in particular the United States, have been indiscriminately bombing civilians for the last 10 fucking years. And that is what is causing this problem. So if Canada wants to be a responsible leader, we need to welcome as many refugees as we can with open arms and respect them and let them do their thing, and that's it.
I agree. All right, ISIS is despicable. The bombing campaigns against them have been totally ineffective and have played completely into the whole, as you said, narrative that they've presented. My concern isn't with ISIS. I am not at the least bit afraid of ISIS. What I'm concerned about are ourselves, Canadians. I'm more likely to be killed by a Canadian terrorist than I am to be killed from any foreign terrorist. Whether we're talking about sovereign citizens or whoever, the fact of the matter is that this country is full of people who feel that multiculturalism is itself a problem, and that they, much like ISIS treats the bombings as part of their narrative, they treat multiculturalism as part of their narrative. They're an isolated group that is being attacked from all sides, and so on. And so what my criticism of multiculturalism is, I guess, fundamentally, is that it creates a very limited scope on what we can and cannot change in our own country. We treat this 30% of the population as unrecoverable. We treat these people who, are fundamentalist, in our case, Christians, as unrecoverable. That there's this group in society, in our society, that we can't possibly communicate with, and we just treat that as just a fact, and we hope that multiculturalism will one day somehow fix that.
Okay, so your grandma's friend that sends you racist memes through email, making fun of Obama, do you really think that you could convince them otherwise?
I think that if we're going to treat this as a serious issue, then yes. We have to go at this from the attitude that we can convince anyone.
Okay, but I'm confused on what you're proposing, because in my opinion, if you look at, say, demographic charts and statistics, younger people in general are way more accepting of other cultures and less likely to vote for the Conservative Party. It seems to me just part of it is a matter of time, where attitudes and perspectives shift over the course of generations. There are some older, racist, conservative elements of this country that are never going to change their minds. And if they are a minority, then why bother? Because we can still win elections.
That is exactly the problem. That is exactly what engenders terrorism. They're a minority, so let's fucking ignore them. That's the problem I'm looking at here. And to treat either immigrants or our own citizens, depending on their proclivities, as a minority, and therefore we should just ignore them, is the issue.
Okay.
That's the common ground I'm looking at here. That we can't just ignore people because they're powerless, because they will use methods to terrify us. Terrorism, right? So that they will use that to try to gain control over us. And the fact of the matter is that whatever you want to say about the Canadian government is we are just as easily terrified and pushed in the direction they want us to go as anyone else.
Well, you just have to look at the shooting incident on the Parliament buildings a few years ago.
Bill C-51, still on the books.
Yeah, and Trudeau, by the way, hasn't done anything about that. But no, I see what you mean. I mean, if we're going to have a environment where you have like sovereign citizens and right-wing terrorists and fanatics and shit like that, but I don't even know what you would do to bring them into the fold. I mean, what do you propose?
Okay, firstly, I'm a socialist, so this is something of a bit of a sidestep for a moment, but bear with me here. I believe the fundamental issue is ultimately capitalism. I believe that this is, as often as anything else, an issue of economics. And unless we're willing to address those economic issues, these problems will remain.
You're talking about unemployment, etc.?
Unemployment, unemployment, access to healthcare, but more than that, just the investment in an economy that we ourselves are able to control, right? That would undermine fundamentally these kinds of attitudes, whether we're talking about sovereign citizens or ISIS. That's what I'm looking at. That's what I'm kind of trying to get at here. And I believe that multiculturalism, for all the good that it can do, for all the good that it has done, is avoiding this much more fundamental problem. And in doing so, is doing what the Liberals are doing as a party, that they're doing one good thing and then having to pair it back with a bunch of bizarre racist sort of appeals. That they're saying, well, we'll bring in immigrants, but it won't be the wrong kind of immigrants. We'll bring in these people, but it won't be bad. We'll have multiculturalism, but it won't be anything you yourself will need to worry about. That's the problem that I think that multiculturalism, liberalism isn't addressing.
How would you propose to address it?
Well, it requires a politically active population. It requires political parties that are deeply invested in socialism, in directly addressing capitalist the profit motive, all that sort of stuff. And that, as I said, is kind of going a bit out of the field of our discussion here, but that without that, we're left with very few options but to just try to kind of hope for the best and wait for a generation to die.
Yeah, I see. So that the divisions that capitalism creates in society are still going to be there. But I think...
as far as reforms go, look, don't get me wrong, I think that multiculturalism is better than what is currently being done in most of Europe. I think that what we're trying to do here is better than what we're doing in America, for instance. But that there comes a point when, as I said, this doesn't come down to 25,000 people. This comes down to millions of people. And there isn't a way to address the broader implications of a refugee crisis or any future refugee crisis without addressing the broader implications of capitalism.
Well, do you think that there is not... do you think there's not a way to take more refugees than 25,000 under our current system? Like, couldn't we take way more?
No, we probably could.
Because socialism isn't going to happen overnight. I agree with you, but this is a short-term problem that needs an immediate, not just a Band-Aid, but
we
something.
live in short-term problems. Our daily lives is a short-term problem. The fact that this refugee crisis is happening today is the problem of today. But I will promise you that 2016 will have plenty of problems all its own, and there will be plenty of people who will be saying that the broader implications need to be ignored for the sake of a simple, direct solution. And what I'm arguing for is admittedly rather difficult given the world we live in, but I'm arguing for sort of a kind of taking a step back and looking at those political issues, looking at those economic issues, because regardless of what we do with the Syrian refugee crisis, there will be new problems. If Canada took in 4 million refugees, that wouldn't solve the world's problems.
No, but it would solve the Syrian refugee crisis.
And that would be one crisis amongst hundreds. There are new things happening every day, and it's a sign of the, I think, incapacity of the way we do politics today, that we treat each and every crisis as just this surprising problem that we have to, deal with as quickly and as efficiently and and using as little political capital as possible.
Well, I mean, you can look at the climate crisis, and that's something that's been going on for a very long time, and that probably speaks. I mean, that alone speaks volumes that we can have as many conferences as we want, and
having conferences in Paris, in fact, to not put too fine a point on it. A city that several weeks ago had been attacked through the use of terrorism is now seeing climate protests being put down on the basis of laws banning public assemblies. But politics is ultimately the arena where these ideas get hashed out. And if we don't have control over our own economy, we don't have control over our politics. And without that, without being able to control our political decisions, everything will be a Band-Aid. And it will just be Band-Aid after Band-Aid put on wound after wound. And we will be just staggering from refugee crisis to refugee crisis. And while Syria is the one of today, who knows what tomorrow will bring, because ultimately capitalism is completely unprepared for it.